Hi guys, it's Dylan from Bijou Diamond Jewellery in London with another watch video, and today we're comparing the Tudor Black Bay with the Rolex Submariner. So I'm going to start the review by taking a look at some brief history of both brands, but actually more specifically at history of both of these watches that we're looking at. Really general history though. If you want to learn more about the history of these two watches, then go and check out my individual reviews of these two. So we're going to go back in time now to the 1950s and look at Rolex as a company. So Rolex released the Submariner back in 1953, and that was as a professional dive watch. A watch really designed with features in mind for professional divers. Things like a 1 or later on 200 meter water resistance rating. Initially it was around 100 meters. Things like a rotating bezel for measuring elapsed time for your dive. Really easy, legible dial, a sports bracelet, etc., etc. Lots of features for that watch were designed, on that watch were designed for a professional diver. The watch was incredibly popular, not only actually with divers, but later on became more popular with just the general public. The reason being is because the watch was so hard wearing and was such a solid piece and really reliable piece. People loved it for everyday use. It was a fantastic daily wearer. It could take the beating of a daily life or more active lifestyle, and therefore it became much more popular with people outside of the diving world. Rolex recognized this and eventually added things like a date window or date function and a few other features that made this watch more wearable for just the general public. Incredibly popular watch, has been one of the most important models for Rolex, and actually within the industry, the watch industry in general, is one of the most important models ever. Briefly looking at the Tudor Black Bay, the Tudor was originally released, or Tudor the brand was originally created in 1926, and that was actually by Hans Wilsdorf, who's the same founder of Rolex. Hans created Tudor as a more affordable brand. Obviously he recognized how successful Rolex was, but realized that people were often being priced out by the higher price point that Rolex was offering. So he wanted to create something that was more approachable for people who didn't have that budget to buy the Rolex. So he introduced Tudor. Tudor featured many of the same designs that Rolex did. In fact, most of the designs that Tudor released were actually kind of copies of Rolex models. The materials were slightly lesser, the quality of finishing was slightly lesser than Rolex. Some of the features were slightly lesser than Rolex to be able to create the watch for that, a fraction of the price. And the watches became really popular with militaries all around the world and armies, etc., etc. So it was a really popular brand straight away. The reference 7922 was released in 1954, 1 year after the Rolex Submariner, and that was pretty much a direct copy of the Rolex Submariner, just for less money. Okay, so that's the real brief history of where these two watches started out. Let's take a look at the philosophies of each brand, Tudor and Rolex. Even though they're technically the same brand, they do have slightly different philosophies in the way in which they create watches and who their clients are. So Rolex really is all about reliability and hard wearing, a really tough timepiece that's designed for daily use and abuse in some ways. They are designed to last for such a long time, generations and generations. They are seen kind of at the pinnacle of daily wearers for the world. Steel models is obviously their most popular, and they are famous for steel sports watches. They're just a brilliant brand. They have kind of the best brand recognition in the watch industry, and actually probably up there with the best brand recognition in the whole world for all brands. Gucci, Louis Vuitton, Rolex is actually really high up in terms of brand recognition. That's because they spend so much on marketing and really are seen as kind of an aspirational thing for many people's life. To be able to own a Rolex is a real milestone in many people's life. Tudor is quite different to that. Tudor is really creating reliable watches, fantastic pieces that are finished to a really nice level, but an absolute fraction of the cost of an equivalent Rolex. Kind of more like a half or a third of the price of a Rolex for an equivalent Tudor. So a big difference in price there. But Tudor still designs watches really cool. They take inspiration from Rolex, obviously being their sister brand, and still maintain a really nice level of quality. All right, so let's take a look at the individual models that we're looking at here. So we're going to start with the Submariner. The Submariner is possibly one of the most iconic watches ever made. It is probably one of the most important watches ever created. It's definitely the most important dive watch ever created. So many watches across the industry have been inspired by the Submariner, from all different brands, high-end and low-end brands. It's possibly one of the most copied watches in the world in terms of faked and counterfeit as well. It's probably the most popular luxury Swiss watch you can buy. It's probably the most common Rolex you'll ever see. Yeah, it's just, I could go on and on about the Submariner. It speaks for itself. It's a fantastic timepiece and will be for many years. It's barely changed over the years, and Rolex is going to try and keep it that way, I'm sure. Moving on now to Tudor, looking at the Black Bay. The Black Bay is a relatively young model in the collection. It's actually only released in 2012, so it's very, very young compared to the Submariner, which has been around since the 50s. The Black Bay, again, not quite as well known as the Submariner. Tudor as a brand is nowhere near as well known as Rolex, but still, still a great brand. It kind of is known, in the industry as the sister brand or the lesser version of a Rolex. Yeah, a great quality piece at kind of half or less than half of the price of a Submariner. Something that I love about the Tudor, which I'll come on to later on, or the Black Bay, is the fact that they really are all about creating pieces with heritage in mind and their history, and creating kind of retro looking watches. I really love that about them. I'll come on to that later on, but that's probably my favorite thing about Tudor. So let's look at some of the features of these two watches. So we'll start with the clasps as always. Looking at the clasp on the Rolex, we've got a fantastic super solid oyster clasp, and the Submariners feature a glide lock clasp, which means you can adjust the bracelet to kind of quite a wide range of sizes, which is brilliant for, when we're selling watches to clients. I know that they can find the exact size for that watch for them on their wrist. Doesn't matter if it's in the summer or the winter, they can adjust it and make sure it fits really, really nicely. The feature was originally designed for divers to be able to wear the watch over the top of a wetsuit and then be able to size it back down again to wear on their bare wrist, rather than having to take out links or add links. The Tudor doesn't have quite the same level of adjustability. I know we're looking at the bracelet version, the straps version here, sorry, in this video, but I will put some pictures of the strap versions on the screen so you can see. The bracelet version features a nice clasp, quite simple, nowhere near the level of quality, in my opinion, or compared to the Rolex clasp, the oyster clasp and glide lock system. The Rolex is far superior here, in my opinion. The feel is definitely much more solid. Moving now onto the bracelet, I'd say this is one of the bigger differences as well between the two. The bracelet on the Tudor is nice. Personally, I'm not a fan of those riveted bolts, but I know that's obviously why they've tried to make it look really similar to one of the original Rolex Submariners. I understand that, and also the 7922. Obviously, we're looking at the Black Bay 58 here, which is a real heritage version. So yes, I understand why they've done the rivets. But the links on this bracelet definitely don't feel as solid as the Rolex links. The Rolex links are very simple, very sleek and clean, and I much prefer that design personally. It definitely feels a much more higher quality bracelet. Moving now onto the case of these two watches. The case on these two is quite different. The Rolex features a super case on this Submariner. The super case features kind of more chunky lugs and a little bit more depth than they used to have. I love the super case. I think they look really, really cool. We've got crown guards obviously on the Rolex versus the Tudor, which doesn't have crown guards. The Rolex is 40mm versus the 39mm Tudor. The Rolex wears a little bit bigger than that kind of difference of only 1mm. You'll definitely see a difference in the size in how they both wear. Case wise, it's kind of, they're both really, really cool in their own right. I love the fact that the Tudor is definitely harking back to a vintage, the 7922 from 1950s, from the late 1950s. I think that's, in my opinion, cooler than the Rolex, but the Rolex case is an iconic case, and it's just a fantastic timepiece. Super solid case. I love the combination of polished and brushed effects on this case, and the little subtle details across the case is really nice. The Tudor obviously features kind of a similar level of finishing anyway. Moving out onto our bezel, we've got a ceramic bezel here on the Rolex with platinum inlays for our index mark, or our different markers, numbers on the bezel, and our lume as well at 12 o'clock, or the top of the bezel. Our Tudor doesn't feature quite the same level of materials here. We've got a aluminium bezel with just kind of painted inlays, that will not last anywhere near as long and look as fresh for as long as the Rolex bezel will. The Rolex bezel will really last a long time. Ceramic is quite a hard material, so it's quite scratch resistant, shouldn't tarnish over time or fade with colors, or fading color. The platinum inlays also mean it's super hard wearing as well. So the Rolex definitely wins there in terms of case, I'd say. Definitely has a more solid feel, also the way the bezel feels as well. Moving now onto our dials. The dials are both really simple dials. We've kind of got gold hands on the Tudor, big chunky hands, which I don't love. I think I much prefer the Mercedes hands on the Rolex. The Rolex just overall has a much more sleeker, simple, more elegant, kind of expensive feel and look versus the Tudor. The Tudor has a bit more of a playful feel, definitely a slightly more lower end feel, but in a good way. It just definitely feels more playful, and that's what Tudor's going for. They're going for a much more playful brand than Rolex is quite a serious brand. So I appreciate the differences, but you can definitely feel, when you're looking at the dial, how the Rolex definitely feels and appears much more luxurious. In terms of weight between the two, the Rolex definitely feels more solid, a little bit more heavy. Just the bracelet definitely, in my opinion, is where you'll feel the biggest difference. The Tudor one feels slightly more tinny than the Rolex one, which just feels much more solid. The weight between the two is definitely, the Rolex wins in terms of weight. Okay, so that kind of concludes the features of the two watches. Now let's have a look overall what I love about each watch. So we'll start with the Submariner. I've actually owned both date and no date Submariner, so I can definitely comment with good knowledge on these watches. I absolutely love the Submariner. It's a total icon. As I said previously, it's a really important watch in the industry, and a milestone in watchmaking in the 50s. And the fact that it's barely changed over the years and still remains to be one of the most popular watches that Rolex does is kind of credit to that design and Rolex as a brand. Fantastic investment piece as well. They are really solid. They're unlike other watches in the Rolex collection that kind of sell for a massive premium over. The Submariners have always remained a good investment. They're always just creeping up in value. They're very solid. They're not selling for insane amounts over their list price, but they are selling for over list. The Submariners are also super solid, probably one of the most solid watches in their collection, along with the other dive watches, of course, like a Deep Sea. But the Submariners are super solid. They're built beautifully, and they really will last forever. You can polish these watches as long as you're not going too hard on them. They will last you for several generations and just keep on going. Probably one of the best daily wearer watches because of that. They're also a piece of history as well when you think about how important that watch was in time in the 50s and how it really changed the industry and how it made sports watches really popular, in fact. So it's a really cool thing to be able to wear that watch. Obviously there's the history of Bond, James Bond wearing a Submariner as well. Plenty of people through time have worn a Submariner, famous, important people. Now moving on to our Black Bay 58. I absolutely love this piece. I love the fact it replicates that 7922 reference and the original Submariner from the 1950s. I wish Rolex did stuff like this, but I suppose that's why they have Tudors. They can be more playful and play around with the designs and not have such pressure to produce those kind of more serious models. I love the fact that it has all those features from that 7924, the dial, the different rivets on the bracelet, the larger crown. Everything about it is really reminiscent of that 7924, which is really cool. One of the best points about this watch is how fantastic that price point is. The fact that it is kind of less than half or around half the price of the equivalent Submariner from Rolex is amazing. And would I say that it's half the watch? Definitely not. I'd say it's a fantastic piece and it's very close to Rolex in terms of its appeal and how good it is as a timepiece. Probably my favorite thing though is that it's actually the best case, I think, dive watch case in the world. I think it's probably the best case size as well at 39mm. It wears beautifully on my wrist. Every client that we have that owns this piece absolutely loves it, and it suits such a huge range of wrists. It's amazing. It is quite deep it's not a very deep watch, but because of its, relative to its case size at 39mm, it does feel quite deep, and that helps it to be able to be worn by people with bigger wrist sizes. So yeah, super versatile in terms of people wearing them. The Submariner is extremely versatile anyway in terms of wrist sizes, but the Tudor is fantastic, and in my opinion is a far more beautiful watch case size and watch case than the Submariner. So yeah, which one would I own of the two? I think it's one of the hardest decisions that I'll make in terms of comparing two watches, because they're both fantastic in their own right. You definitely cannot go wrong with either watch, absolutely not. They both have such fantastic appeal for their own reasons. But one thing I would say is that probably personally I would choose the Submariner purely because I think its presence is just a little bit greater than that of the Tudor. It is a Rolex at the end of the day, and it goes with that kind of the connotations of a Rolex, the fact that it's so reliable. It's a fantastic timepiece, and it is kind of, in most people's eyes, the pinnacle of luxury Swiss watches. You know, obviously people in the industry know there's better out there, but the general public see Rolex as the top. I think if I was to own the Tudor, I'd always kind of be a bit envious of anyone that had a Rolex. I'd always really deep down want the Rolex. That's not saying that clients that own the Tudors, or our clients that own Tudors, don't love their Tudors. They absolutely do love them. But I think probably if I was to offer them a Tudor or a Rolex, they'd probably pick the Rolex. Saying that though, I do find the Tudor Black Bay 58 far more beautiful looking as a watch than the Submariner. So it's kind of a really difficult decision. I think obviously in an ideal world, you'll own both of these watches. I just love the vintage feel that the Tudor offers. Thanks guys for watching. Let us know in the comments which of these two watches you would choose, the Black Bay 58 or the Black Bay in general, or the Rolex Submariner in all variations, bimetal, gold, blah, 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 blah. Let us know in the comments what else you'd like us to compare, what other watches. And as always, if you're interested in either of these watches, then don't hesitate to contact us. Our details are in the description. And also at the end of the video, it'd be a pleasure to call either of these watches into stock for you.